Today we're going to do a final timeline review over what is hopefully going to be the whole course. This should take about 40 minutes. I hope to get you, or maybe 30 minutes. I hope to get you out of here by 3, maybe 3:05. I'm going to roll through everything as fast as I can. You can follow along. I highly suggest, for no other reason than muscle memory, try writing some of this down and following along. If that doesn't work, then skip it. The first era we started with was called the Renaissance, right? Usually goes from 1400 all the way usually into the 1600s, okay? That's the Renaissance. Now, before we talk about the details, we split the Renaissance up into two eras. There's no clear split, but I usually say about 1500. You're not wrong. About 1500, maybe a little later. The first part of the Renaissance here is the Italian Renaissance, right? What are the characteristics of the Italian Renaissance? You should know humanism. What else do I have? Secularism, which is the idea of non-religion, right? We're going towards the Enlightenment. We're getting from secularism, which just means non-religion, we're going into the age of reason, okay? That's a great gateway. Machiavellian, and one that I have not stressed much in my previous reviews, but patronage. And I stress that because it's actually in the key concepts in 2 or 3 different places. So please know the term patronage, where it is and why it's significant. The other side, past 1500s, there's finally a little more on the northern or the late. You'll see it use both terms, but the northern Renaissance or the late Renaissance. The primary difference there is religion. That is where you see Christian humanism. The combination of religion and religion and humanism. Now, that is where people like Pico Mirandola talked about free will, right? Still want to get to heaven, but we do have some free will and choice. That's the perfect example of humanism. That etching you saw today, life in 1560. By the time we get here, Bruegel's is northern. By the time we get here, we're focused more on everyday life. We've moved completely away from religious subject matter and started to try and figure out what normal life is like. In the background of much of the Renaissance, right? As humanism and secularism spread to the north, all of a sudden, bam! We see the Protestant Reformation. Oh, one that stands alone right here is what? Printing press, you should know. Good. Because that impacts both the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. So, we have the Protestant Reformation right here. You can usually say Protestant Reformation is all of the 1500s, all of the 16th century. So, the Reformation we split into 2 parts. The early part and the later part, even though they overlap. The first part is Protestantism. The Protestant, where they are protesting the current power, protesting the Roman Catholic Church. It's all about changing the status quo, about changing religion. But what it's really about is changing political power. The biggest enemy in the Protestant Reformation is the clergy. That's why we love the term anti-clericalism. If you get anything about the Protestant Reformation, guys, you're going to remember 1517. You're going to remember the 95 Theses. You're going to remember Martin Luther. Okay? What I want you to remember also is anti-clericalism. What headings go under anti-clericalism? Now, anti-clericalism means anti-clergy. Simony, right? The selling of church offices. Nepotism, giving it to your friends and families. Pluralism, holding multiple offices out. Multiple offices. Multiple offices, which leads to absenteeism. What's the big one, though, you really put under it? Indulgences. That's abuse by the clergy. Why have they been able to abuse it for so long? Because they are the key holders to heaven. They are the ones who learn and figure out exactly where or how you get into heaven, because they're the only ones who can do what? Read the Bible. Well, this changes everything. So we have the Protestant Reformation. A lot of people leave. Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists, they all break away from the Roman Catholic Church. So, to try and stop the bleeding, the Catholics have their own Reformation. It's called the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. They don't repair the damage. They don't say, we're sorry, and everybody comes back and we're all Catholic again and happy. The divide is permanent, but they do stop the bleeding. They do put a Band-Aid on and stop all these people in countries from leaving the Roman Catholic Church. For Catholic Reformation, we should have the Council of Trent. And I will usually put the Jesuits in there. The Jesuits are not the only body, but if you remember that the Jesuits were the one of the religious groups that hopefully you'll remember Loyola, you'll remember the Ursuline Order of Nuns, Angela Merici, St. Teresa of Avila, all of them are about the Catholic Reformation. Now, in the background of all of this, we have the kings and queens. I struggle where to put these guys and gals, but we'll put them right here because usually when you see these two individuals mentioned, it's under the Protestant Reformation. That's the Tudor dynasty. Most notably Henry VIII, and most notably Elizabeth I. Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Okay. Most of Henry VIII splits and creates the Anglican Church. Divorces a bunch of people to have a son, gets a son, that guy becomes king and dies, oldest daughter becomes queen, creates religious tension and dies, and then Elizabeth comes along. In the background of this, so what is the ultimate offshoot of the Protestant Reformation? Is that we have religious conflict. And the number one place where there's religious conflict is where in Europe in the 1500s? It's the Holy Roman Empire, okay? And we know that because in 1555, we had the Peace of Augsburg. Because of all the violence in the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs said, listen, we have to calm things down. The only way we can calm things down is to actually let Protestants be Protestants. Okay? What other country has a lot of problems, religious violence during this time? Spain does too. They have the Inquisition. They're a little sooner than everybody else because they have no problem slicing everybody's head off. Or, remember the Spanish donkey and stuff like that? The good torture methods out there. The other one is France. In the 1500s, right here, that is the Huguenots, the French Wars of Religion, Henry IV, St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and ultimately right here, the Edict of Nantes. All right, stuff like that you know. Okay? Those are all religious violence. Number 3, exploration. Yes. Exploration, let's put, you got to start in the 1400s. Take it all the way to ish. That's 16. All right. Nope. Exploration. Okay. Most notable early thing of the explorers is Henry, the Navigator, right, of Portugal. He does a couple things. Number one, he helps inspire exploration, gets new technology. What's some of that technology? Caravel, astrolabe, map and compass. Probably enough. There's a couple more in there. And what is the purpose for exploration? If you remember God, glory, gold, you'll probably be able to answer any question about it. God, glory, and gold. So, religion spread Christianity, glory, nationalism, competition, and gold, not just gold, but all luxury goods, just like we did today in class, right? Spices, silk, eventually tobacco, coffee. All right. Now, facts of of exploration. The Atlantic becomes the new center of trade. It's no longer the Indian Ocean. It's no longer the Mediterranean. Now it is the Atlantic. And what is the what's the biggest impact here? Number one, the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange. What are some of the goods that go from Europe to the New World? Disease and horses, right? They change everything in the New World. What's a couple things that come from the New World to Europe? Potatoes, corn, llamas, coffee. Squash. Big one, I forget. Not pumpkin or squash. Okay, corn and coffee, tobacco, sure. All right. Sugar. A lot of these crops, these luxury crops, require a lot of labor. So we end up with slavery and the triangle trade, right? Okay. All of this, what you saw today, also in a short answer question, is that all of this leads to rivalry. Or competition might be a better word. Same distance, same difference. Right? It leads to a new economic system of a balance of trade, which is mercantilism. And finally, one big point that I didn't mention until we got to the timelines. The new elites. The new elites that are ultimately going to upend society. Okay? What comes next is absolutism. Kind of in the background of all this, but significant nonetheless. Absolutism. Always think Louis XIII, Louis XIV. Let's do early 1600s into 1720s or 1730s. Absolutism. Louis XIII, Louis XIV, if we got to cut it down. We know. Who's the other guy we should know? Peter the Great. Now, if we had to simplify and only know a couple things, I say number one, divine right. That teaches you Sun King. It teaches you old world stuff, kind of feudalism. This is not very age of reasoning. And centralizing. Next to centralizer, whatever you have, draw the triangle. Draw the triangle and you memorize, what are they centralizing? The government, bureaucracy. What else are they centralizing? Big countries with big economies with maybe big religion once again, right? Revoke the Edict of None, but the big one is big armies, right? If you want a large-scale professional army, you need a big, powerful king who can collect those goods, or collect the tax money and actually raise the army. The one thing I would put in absolutism is the opposite of absolutism. What's the opposite of absolutism in this time period? Constitutionalization. Constitutionalism. There we go. Right? You are limiting the power of the king. And even though the Netherlands and a couple other countries, the country you think of on not letting the king take total control, of course, is England. Which means you will know the English Civil War, which leads ultimately to the Glorious Revolution. Number 3, the agricultural route. Agricultural generally comes right after exploration and goes into here-ish. What's going to come after the agricultural rev? The industrial rev. Okay, we don't know where because some countries go into the industrial rev earlier than others, right? England's going to enter the industrial rev more than other countries, okay? France is certainly not going to be there when they're in the midst of fighting the French Revolution, okay? Now, early in the agricultural revolution, the type of agriculture is called subsistence, right? It's where you grow food for your family and you very rarely have profits. It's nice because you rule yourself, but it's bad because with never having profits, never being able to buy stuff, you will never really have a super great, wonderful quality of life. This is the thing you need to remember. We move in the agricultural revolution from subsistence farming to commercial farming. If you remember that, everything else ties into subsistence farming to commercial farming. What's the biggest point making us into? What's the biggest thing that shifts us into commercial farming? That's enclosure. Right? Enclosure. Where the land is bought up by the rich. And where did they get the money to buy up all this? Exploration. Exploration, right? The price revolution. After 1492, we've discovered the New World. By the 1500s, Spain is starting to import tons of gold from Bolivia. A lot of that gold goes to the European economy. But where does most of the gold go when it gets there? Into the hands of the rich. What do the rich do? They start buying up farmland. Because of new agricultural policy or techniques, now farmland's actually worth something. So they buy it all up. The elites are the ones buying up. What this leads us to is our big fancy word called proletarianization. proletarianization and industrious revolution. It's when peasant farmers no longer have own lands and they no longer actually produce food. From now on, they will only earn wages. And since they only earn wages, what happens is, number one, we will urbanize at the end of the agricultural revolution. That comes with a bunch of problems. What are the problems with urbanization? Overcrowding leads to sanitation, housing, crime, debauchery, prostitution, all that junk. Those are the problems that pop up. When we get to the Industrial Revolution, we'll actually fix those problems. Okay? We also see the market and the putting out system. That's when families worked in their own homes to create goods to sell for a wage. Then they would have to take that money and buy food. They were not making it themselves anymore. Ultimately, down the road, this is all leading to the commercial revolution. It's all leading to the change, right? And actually buying and selling goods at a large scale. Our last 2 points for this section are, of course, the two very most important. Number one, right here, let's start with the 1500s and go all the way to here. All the way to the 1790s is what most important part of early European history. And that's the age of reason. Big star. Know it, and know it well. Know what comes before it, know what comes after it, know its characteristics, know its changes. The ultimate point of the age of reason is that we're moving from faith to reason. We will do it in the natural world, just like we started doing right here with painting. We will now do with science early on. We'll apply reason to the natural world instead of faith. And then we will stop accepting that society and politics are the way they are because that's how they should be. And we will start analyzing them to decide what's best for society. So if you have to split this, again, it's no clear line, but usually about 1600, a little after, we'll draw the line. And we'll say the first half of the age of reason is the science revolution. Right? Most important part of the scientific revolution is what? Empiricism, maybe. I think that leads to the most important part. Scientific method. That brings everything together. Empiricism, we have to observe it. Scientific method, we have to actually test it. Now, within the scientific method, there's two major parts of science. Number one is astronomy. People studying the heavens. Biggest point there is heliocentric. And even though we won't mention it today, you still need to know their names. Who's the most famous astronomers you should know? Copernicus, Galileo, Newton. Right? You can also throw in Kepler. There's at least one more, but that's good. Right? Know them. They're applying the scientific method to the heavens. They are not accepting that things are perfect up there. They are instead observing and testing. Okay. The number two is physicians. By the way, astronomy, I guess we should say, leads to what other branch that really takes off in the mathematics? I put math there because you're going to remember Descartes through math rather than astronomy of the body. Physicians, now we are analyzing the body. We are not simply like this because God made us want to look like this. The inside of our body is not just filled with randomly named liquid. Let's test it. Most famous physician, the number one you need to know is Harvey. You can also know, what's the gray box? Like Versailles?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't even think that's spelled right, but if you guess on the test, I'd be happy to give you points, okay? That's the age of reason. The other part is the Enlightenment, which we hopefully know already. Now we are applying reason to two parts. Society, which is social structure, and government. Who are the most famous government thinkers? Again, it's not on here, but you should still know it.
Locke.
John Locke, natural rights. What else? Rousseau, maybe. Democracy. Who's the other big one? Montesquieu and Three Branches of Government, the Spirit of Laws. Who's the most famous social thinkers? Usually we put Rousseau in social. What? Voltaire is most important. Using wit and sarcasm. Who's Voltaire's main targets? The church and kings and nobles, right? The whole social structure. And he uses sarcasm to attack them, right? Where do people learn about and spread the Enlightenment? Salons. That's what I always used to teach. But if you see coffee houses, if you see taverns, if you see, they're like academias, if you see libraries, it's all about spreading the Enlightenment, discussing, spreading, reading. And then finally, it feels weird putting them in because I know it doesn't fit, but the enlightened despots. These were absolute rulers who tried to rule nicely. Okay? Frederick William I, Frederick II, Maria Theresa, all of them in there. And finally, our last one I will cover very briefly, not because it's not important, but because you know it. 1789 to 1815 is the French Rev. What is the cause of the French Rev? What are the causes? There's two things. What's a long-term cause of the French Rev? No, long-term cause. Three estates. Right? Especially the old nobility and the fact that they're giving. Why is it being challenged now? Why in the 1780s? Because we've had these Enlightenment thinkers that are saying, hey, this doesn't make any sense. It's not based in reason. Why else now? Because of these new elites that are emerging just 100 or so years beforehand. They are challenging. So the estates are long term. What's the short term? Famine and food problems in the 1780s and closer. Remember we talked, Louis XV dies in 1715. What happens to France after that? It goes down. Right along the death spiral in the 1760s. It fights the 7 Years' War and loses. Wars are expensive but can pay off as long as you don't lose. So they have huge debt problems. And very quickly, we end up with the three phases of the French Rev. The first one is the liberal phase. What are the documents of the liberal phase of the revolution? Constitution of 1791. Declaration of the Rights of Man. Those are the two you should probably definitely know. You can also throw in Tennis Court Oath. You can also throw in Declaration of the Rights of Women. What else is there? National Assembly, sure. But that doesn't work. So we move to the radical phase of the French Revolution. Radical phase starts with what? The chopping off the head of a divinely appointed king, which does backfire because that riles up the rest of Europe against the French Rev. What's the number one thing you should know about the radical phase? Reign of terror. That drives people away from it. We eventually end up with the third phase, the Napoleonic phase. There are more key concepts written about this man than any other human being in European history. Go back tonight and study his key concepts especially. Take 1 minute of your life and reread them. There's more about him than anywhere else. Okay? Ultimately, though, he gets destroyed and we move on to what? Congress of Vienna. That ends this timeline. We have one more. This is the most complicated. Miss Rogers yelling at her tennis team in there. One guy playing that. timeline, you do whatever you want. I think the clusters that you always come back to are humanism and virtue. Humanism, virtue, and reason. Faith to reason. I think everything that we talked about comes around to that. All right. On to timeline number 2. A lot of stuff here, but we should be able to go relatively quickly. Now, we pick up the only one that, not the only one, but the one that really extends over is right here. The agricultural revolution, okay, goes into the 1700s. We don't really know where the line is. But with the agricultural revolution, the biggest impact overall that we talked about, we just talked about, is urbanization and all the challenges that come with it. Overpopulation, all this other junk, right? Population rises, and all the population that goes in it. And that leads into the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution you always kind of put up here to World War I. The Industrial Revolution. Now, there's a couple things. First off, to try and solve these problems caused by overpopulation, the government in cities expands. How does the government in cities expand? A couple different ways. Number one, well, overall, it builds up its infrastructure. That's a long way of saying it does a couple things. The number one that we remember is health. Okay? It builds sewers. It builds new water so that people stop being sick and they can start contributing to society. Also in infrastructure, maybe even in health, you can put education. Right? Public education starts to explode. The first public education really in Europe is Napoleon Bonaparte. After that, it blows up and gets bigger and bigger. And the last one we should mention, even though it's a big thing, we'll talk about it real quick. Science. Okay? Science at the time. The number one area where science is applied, medicine. That's Louis Pasteur's germ theory. That is Lister's antiseptic. Quinine, very good. Which we'll talk about when we get to imperialism. The other things for science outside of medicine, Darwin, okay, natural selection, applying reason to how people evolved or how everything evolved, and then finally, I don't know if it super fits, but I like it because we see scientific socialism all the time, is Karl Marx. Let's stop assuming that society works best because this is how it's always worked. Let's apply reason and test different points in society. Now, the other things you should know for the Industrial Revolution is that early on, it's all British. The British lead. And why are the British lead? Why are they first? Resources, iron and coal. Why else? They're an island, so no wars. Why else? Not colonies, sure, but I would say exploration. Exploration really influences them early on. If you look back at your structure, exploration is going on up until like here in agricultural rep. Okay, all of those reasons. Then we have the rest of Europe. Right. Rest of Europe. How is the rest of Europe industrializing? Primarily, how is it different from Britain? The government. The government subsidized. The government intervenes and helps their economies along. They'd never catch up to Britain if they didn't. What's the number one way the government helps? Transportation. They build railroad systems for their people. And we should mention Eastern Europe. How's Eastern Europe doing? They don't have resources. They don't have transportation. They don't have strong governments that can really help everything along. So it all kind of collapses. And the last thing is I should have mentioned, when do we see it spread from Britain to the rest of Europe? 1851, the Great Exhibition of the Crystal Palace. That's industrialization. Next up. In the background of all this, and rightfully so, we see imperialism. I also put imperialism up until World War I. Imperialism, there aren't too many key concepts I think are super important. Number one, the reason for imperialism overall is what? Trade. With industrialization, we need raw materials and we need to sell our goods. Part of it's mercantilism, part of it's laissez-faire. The other reason for imperialism is nationalism. Right? Nationalism leads to what? Competition. Competition between nations leads to tension, and tension leads to World War I. There's a reason it comes right at the end of imperialism. And then finally, I think we should note the non-West response. The non-West response. What are the non-Western responses to imperialism? Anger. Give me examples. India, Sepoy Rebellion. Revolution in Haiti, that's French Rev. And ideals of the French Rev, not imperialism. So you're not crazy wrong. Yeah.
Isn't there one like the Africa with the Maxim machine guns?
That's in the Sudan, but it's not one of the gray box. Yeah. Zulu, Sepoys, Magi Restoration, which instead of a violent revolt, they tried to build up their own country, Japan, and they did well. Boxer Rebellion. Good. Try to get rid of all the foreigners. Those are non-Western responses. You're not wrong with Haiti and the overture, but it's not mentioned here in the key concepts. So you might want to stay away from it. He's more French Rev than anything else. All right. Conservative versus liberal in the 1800s. 1815, we have the Congress of Vienna, the end of Napoleon, all that. So we have conservative versus liberal, and let's put nationalism here. What we really mean is unification. Okay, so number one, for the conservatives, we have the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna is led by Metternich. They're talking about traditional conservatism, the nobles, the kings, let's keep the peasants down, nobody can vote, all this other junk. And in order to ensure that they stay in power and no other revolutions come along, they create something called the Concert of Europe, or the Congress of Europe, something like that. Congress system, thank you. To try and squash all the liberal rebellions. It works for about 50 years until the 1850s, and then it all breaks apart. All right? The liberal side, we see people like Karl Marx come to power. And what Marx talks about more than anything else is he is highlighting the workers. He is highlighting the workers, and we'll see that with the Russians here in a second. Now, under nationalism or unification, this all comes after 1850, after the collapse of this conservative power. All right? And the two guys you need to know, we know, are Bismarck and Cavour. Bismarck and Cavour. And what's the good word? How do they both unify their countries? Realpolitik. Applying realism or reason instead of faith. Instead of just assuming people are doing things, let's use diplomacy. Let's come up with reasons to get things done. Let's come up with technology and use war. The one negative part for Europe in this nationalism thing is the Balkans. They start to split apart. And that is another lead-in to World War I. World War I! World War I is 1914 to 1918. 1914 to 1918. There's almost nothing you need to know here. Or, excuse me. There's nothing I think you need to study for World War I tonight, this late. What you need to know are the causes. M-A-I-N. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. What's the biggest outcome for World War I?
World War II.
Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles. The problems with the Treaty of Versailles, nobody's happy. It punishes Germany with reparations and war guilt. Sucks. Talk about the self-determination that really kind of rips things apart. This leads to right here. We end up, what's the era after World War I called? Anxiety. Talk about Europe having an existential crisis here, right? Surrealism, Salvatore Dali, the really weird stuff. Why is this eggs of anxiety right here? Because World War I was so destructive. It was so violent. It was so deadly. People didn't know what to think or what to do. It's heightened by the Great Depression. It's heightened by Germany and the Weimar Republic suffering and the hyperinflation. It sucks. some goodish things maybe, or some outcomes of this. We talked about science. We talked about science in this era. What was the kind of science in this era?
Questioning everything.
No. Question. Einstein. The theory of relativity, right? That doesn't really make sense. He's not observed. He's kind of getting the observation, but you see how that's out there. Who else was the scientist here? You guys remember?
Heisenberg.
Stop saying Freud! God. What?
Heisenberg.
Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle. Remember, Planck is looking at the atoms, and Marie Curie is looking at radiation. This new type of kind of uncertain super testing science. We also see, I know nobody here knows, but we also see some psychology changes with Freud. Trying to understand how the brain works. All right. We have a couple more things. Now, we are starting to get into new stuff. Not new stuff, but stuff that I have not had the chance to make a timeline on. So, let's look at the Russian Rev. The Russian Rev really takes off after World War I. Okay? So, 1917, we see the Russian Rev. And what are the causes of the Russian Rev? World War I really sucks for Russia, even more so than other countries. The other reason is the old feudal society. Right? The old feudal society, where the nobles rule and the king's in power and people don't have any kind of freedom. They've been backward for so long. They have they finally have the revolts and overthrow the Romanovs. The first one's the February Revolt. That's kind of like the French Revolution. That's the liberal phase of the Russian Revolution. They overthrow the Tsar and put in a kind of democratic government. Next, after the liberal phase, is the radical phase. What is the radical phase of the Russian Revolution? The October Revolution, Red October. Who overthrows the government then? Lenin, believing the ideas of Karl Marx. Believing the ideas of Karl Marx, and with a party of Bolsheviks. With a party of Bolsheviks behind them. All right? They rule for a while, but after the Bolsheviks take over, what happens to Russia? Civil war. Really sucks. Lenin tries a couple things. He tries his new economic policy and whatnot, but we end up in the end with Stalin. There's a lot of key concepts here. I'm oversimplifying, but for Stalin, he does two things to the economy. Two things to Russia. Number one, how does he get control of the country? The Great Purges. And how does he get control of the economy? 5-year plans. 5-year plans had two sides. What does he do with agriculture? Collectivization. Moving everybody to great giant state-owned farms. What would you synthesize that with? Enclosure. What did you say? Okay. Enclosure. Does it work for Stalin? Not at first. A lot of people are going to die. What does he do? How does it work for industry, though? When he redoes the industry, right? Soviets may have a very good heavy industry for a long time. And let's cover the Cold War real quick, just because it fits and we'll go faster. I got about 4 more minutes, guys. I'll be done, I promise you. In the Cold War, having to do with the Soviet Revolution, you should know what the Marshall Plan was. But that all has to do with the Cold War, right? Why do we spend so much money helping France and England and Western countries so that they don't turn towards socialism? Okay? The Russians try to do the same stuff as we do, but it's just not that powerful. We create things like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. We create things like the World Bank so that third world countries can get money. Why do we want third world countries to get money? Because they're super nice on the inside and we love helping people? No! Because we don't want them to turn communists. All right? 2 areas of the world we should mention for the Cold War, the Eastern Bloc. How's the Eastern Bloc do during the Cold War? Kind of sucktacular, right? Not very good. Right? So, they will eventually fall. And guys, here's a big thing. We'll get there. And then finally, the rest of the world. How does the Cold War explode in the rest of the world? Vietnam, Korea, what else? Do we know any other conflict of the Cold War? Cuba would be good. We talked about some Israel-Palestine conflicts, the Arab world, Afghanistan, and the Soviets. All that's good. World War II. I will keep World War II exceptionally brief, so maybe you can remember some of it. World War II, there's not much about the war. What do we care about? Dictators. Stalin is, of course, part of that. Know everything Stalin does, okay? But why do people turn towards dictators? Nationalism and racism. Racism is essentially ultimate nationalism, right? Not only is our country phenomenal, but our people is phenomenal too, right? We're better than everybody else. Social Darwinism. We are more evolved than the rest of the world, okay? Why else do we end up here? The biggest reason is the Treaty of Versailles. That leads to suffering in Germany. That leads to struggling in Italy. And it leads to appeasement. The rest of Europe wants to appease Adolf Hitler and appease the aggressive powers in the world because we saw how destructive World War I was, and we want to avoid it. The last point is with America. It's USA isolationism. Because we don't want to be a part of the rest of the world's affairs, we simply let it happen. Our last column of the year is modern Europe. Just to sum up some of this stuff. After World War II, what happens with social welfare? It increases exponentially. When we get to the 70s and 80s, what happens with social welfare? Why does it decrease? Neoliberalism. That is new conservatism, really. That's Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. Okay? If you get a question about women at any point in kind of modern society, you will mention the pill. Right? It's a great key concept, and it's an excellent point. What are the effects of it? Positive and negative, right? Social, like religious problems, still a little with the pill, but what's the social consequences? Generally benefit for women in general. Now, in the 90s, we see the collapse of the USSR, of the Soviet Union. What's the consequences of the collapse? It's the Cold War. America is now the dominant power in the world, and there's nobody to stand up against it. What happens to the old Eastern Bloc countries if the Soviet Union falls apart? They all fight, they all get their independence. Some do it violently, right? Like Romania. Some do it peacefully. Okay? But they all get their independence. There are a couple small nationalistic movements. I would call it radical nationalism. What are some of the small radical nationalism movements we see throughout the 90s and 2000s? What's the best example? You just said it, the IRA. What's the Spain one in the Basque region? I forget the name of one. Is it just called the Basque region? Yeah. The ETA. It's called the ETA, but same concept. Chechnya against Russia. All right? Those are it. And my final point is the one I told you that it's going to be your essay. I've said that for the last 3 years. I haven't been right yet, but one day I'm going to be right. That is the creation of a united Europe. And what I would put first is the common market should be first. Common market, you guys remember talking about the OEEC? Common market, OEEC, and then we have the Maastricht Treaty with the Euro and the EU. And Europe is becoming more unified. Any major questions? Thank you guys for staying.